Hey guys, we're going to do something a little different today. I love Curious George. I just enjoy him so much. And I have a great big book of Curious George stories. And so today we're going to do a longer video and I'm going to read those stories to you. I think there are 7 Curious George stories in this book. Let's see. We're going to share the screen. That's done. We're going to make the book bigger, and that's done. And now we're going to read about Curious George. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. One day, George saw a man. He had on a large yellow straw hat. The man saw George too. What a nice little monkey, he thought. I would like to take him home with me. He put his hat on the ground, and of course, George was curious. He came down from the tree to look at the large yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head. He picked it up and put it on. The hat covered George's head. He couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly and popped him into a bag. George was caught. The man with the big yellow hat put George into a little boat, and a sailor rowed them both across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but he was still a little curious. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, "George, I am taking you to a big zoo in a big city. You will like it there. Now run along and play and don't get into trouble." George promised to be good, but it is easy for little monkeys to forget. On the deck, he found some seagulls. He wondered how they could fly. George was very curious. Finally, he had to try. It looked easy, but oh, what happened? First this, and then this. I don't think George could fly, guys. Where is George? The sailors looked and looked. At last they saw him struggling in the water and almost all tired out. "Man overboard!" the sailors cried, and they threw him a life belt. George caught it and held on. At last he was safe aboard. After that, George was more careful to be a good monkey, until at last the long trip was over. George said goodbye to the kind sailors, and he and the man with the yellow hat walked off the ship onto the shore and on into the city to the man's house. After a good meal and a good pipe, George felt very tired. Look at those pajamas. They're just huge on George. He crawled into bed and fell asleep at once. The next morning, the man telephoned the zoo. George watched him. He was fascinated. Then the man went away. George was curious. He wanted to telephone too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What fun! Ding-a-ling-a-ling! George had telephoned the fire station. The firemen rushed to the telephone. "Hello, hello," they said, but there was no answer. Then they looked for the signal on a big map that showed where the telephone call had come from. They didn't know it was from George. They thought it was a real fire. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" The firemen jumped on the fire engines and onto the hook and ladders. "Ding dong, ding dong! Everyone out of the way! Hurry, hurry, hurry!" The firemen rushed into the house. They opened the door. No fire! Only a naughty little monkey. "Oh, catch him, they cried. George tried to run away. He almost did, but he got caught in the telephone wire and a thin fireman caught one arm and a fat fireman caught the other. "You fooled the fire department," they said. "We will have to shut you up where you can't do any more harm." They took him away and shut him in a prison. George wanted to get out. He climbed up to the window to try the bars. Just then the watchman came in. He got on the wooden bed to catch George, but he was too big and heavy. The bed tipped up, the watchman fell over, and quick as lightning, George ran out through the open door. He hurried through the building and out onto the roof. And then he was lucky to be a monkey. Out he walked onto the telephone wires. Quickly and quietly over the guard's head, George walked away. He was free. Down in the street outside the prison walls stood a balloon man. A little girl bought a balloon for her brother. George watched. He was curious again. He felt he must have a bright red balloon. He reached over and tried to help himself, but instead of one balloon, the whole bunch broke loose. In an instant, the wind whisked them all away, and with them went George, holding tight with both hands. Up, up he sailed, higher and higher. The houses looked like toy houses, and the people like dolls. George was frightened. He held on very tight. At first, the wind blew in great gusts. Then it quieted. Finally, it stopped blowing altogether. George was very tired. Down, down he went. Bump onto the top of a traffic light. Everyone was surprised. The traffic got all mixed up. George didn't know what to do. And then he heard someone call, "George!" He looked down and saw his friend, the man with the big yellow hat. George was very happy. The man was happy too. George slid down the post, and the man with the big yellow hat put him under his arm. Then he paid the balloon man for all the balloons, and then George and the man climbed into the car, and at last away they went. To the zoo. What a nice place for George to live. Curious George takes a job. What do you think about a monkey taking a job? What do you think will happen? Let's find out. This is George. He lived in the zoo. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. He wanted to find out what was going on outside the zoo. One day, when the keeper was not paying attention, George got hold of the key for the cage. When the keeper discovered what had happened, it was too late. George was gone. Where was George? They looked for him everywhere, but they could not find him. George was hiding in the hay of his friend the elephant. Finally, the keepers gave up looking for him. George found a nice cozy spot to sleep under the elephant's right ear, and the next morning, before the zoo opened, he got away safely. Once in the street, George felt a little scared. What should he do in the big city? Maybe he could find his friend, the man with the yellow hat, who had brought him over from Africa a long time ago. Only George did not know where he lived. There was a bus stopping at the corner. George had never ridden on one. Quickly, he climbed a lamppost, jumped on top of the bus, and off they went. Now they were right in the center of the town. There was so much to see that George did not know where to look first. If only he could go on riding like this forever. But after a while, George got tired and a little dizzy. When the bus slowed down to turn onto a side street, George jumped off. There was a restaurant right in front of him. Something smelled good. Suddenly, George felt very hungry. The kitchen door stood open and George walked in. On the table was a big pot. Of course, George was curious. He had to find out what was in it. When the cook came back, he had a big surprise. Spaghetti was all over the place, and in the middle of it was a little monkey. George had been eating yards and yards and had wound himself all up in it. The cook was a kind man and did not scold much, but George had to clean up the kitchen and then do all the dishes. My, what a lot of them there were. The cook was watching George. "You are lucky to have 4 hands," he said. "You can do things twice as quickly." "I have a friend who could use a handy little fellow like you to wash windows. If you would like to, I will take you over to him." So they went down into the subway and took an uptown train to the cook's friend, who was an elevator man in a skyscraper. "Sure, I can use you," the elevator man said to George. "I will give you what you need for the job. You can start right away. But remember, you are here for washing windows. Never mind what people inside the house are doing. Don't be curious or you'll get into trouble." George promised to be good. But little monkeys sometimes forget. George was ready to start. My, how many windows there were. Look at all those windows. I don't even want to try to count them. There are so many windows. George got ahead quickly since he worked with all 4 hands. He jumped from window to window just as he had once jumped from tree to tree in the African jungle. For a while, George stuck to his work and did not pay any attention to the people inside. Of course, he was curious, but he remembered his promise. In one room, a little boy was crying because he did not want to eat his spinach. George did not even look, but went right on with his work. In another room, a man was taking a nap and snoring. George was sorry it was not his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He listened to the funny noise for a while, but then went on working. But what was going on here? George stopped working and pressed his nose against the window. 2 painters were working inside. George was fascinated. Painting looked like a lot more fun than washing windows. The painters were getting ready to go out for lunch. The minute they left, George climbed inside. What wonderful paints and brushes they had! George could not resist. An hour later, the painters came back. They opened the door and stood there with their mouths wide open. The whole room had changed into a jungle with palm trees all over the walls, and a giraffe and 2 leopards and a zebra, and a little monkey was busy painting himself on one of the trees. Then the painters knew what had happened. Luckily, George was close to a door. He ran out as fast as he could. After him ran the 2 painters, then the elevator man, and then the woman who lived in the place. "Oh, my lovely room," cried the woman. "Don't let him get away." George headed for the fire escape. George reached the end of the fire escape. The others had not caught up with him yet. Here was his chance. They could not jump, but George could easily jump down and escape. In a moment he would be safe. Poor little George. He had forgotten that the pavement was as hard as stone and not like the soft grass of the jungle. Too bad. The fall broke his leg, and an ambulance came to take George to the hospital. "He got what he deserved," said the woman, "making my apartment into a jungle indeed." "I told him he would get into trouble," the elevator man added. He was too curious. George had to lie in bed with his leg high up in a plaster cast. He was very unhappy. And it had all started out so nicely. If only he had not been so curious, he could have had a lot of fun. Now it was too late. But next morning, George's friend, the man with the yellow hat, was buying his newspaper. Suddenly he got very excited. "This is George," he shouted when he saw the picture on the front page. Quickly, he read the whole story and then ran to a telephone booth to ring the hospital. "I am George's friend," he said to the nurse who answered the telephone. "Please take good care of him so that he will get better quickly. I want to take him to a movie studio and make a picture about his life in the jungle. Don't let him get into any more mischief until I can take him away." Finally, the day came when George could walk again. "Your friend is going to take you away this morning," said the nurse. "Just wait right here for him. and don't touch anything. As soon as George was alone, he looked around at all the strange hospital things. I wonder what's in that big blue bottle, he thought. George was very curious. It smelled funny. Suddenly his head began to turn. Then he felt as if he were flying. Then rings and stars danced before his eyes. Then everything went dark. George had smelled the ether. And this is how the man with the yellow hat found George when he came to call for him. They picked him up and shook him, but they could not wake him up. He was so fast asleep that finally they had to put him under the shower. How surprised he was when he woke up. George said goodbye to the nurse and the kind doctor. Then he and the man with the yellow hat got into the car to drive to the movie studio. In the president's office, George had to sign a contract. Now he was a movie actor. In the studio, George was kept so busy all the time that he forgot to be curious. He liked the jungle they made for him and played happily there. And when the picture was, and let me just slide this out of the way. When the picture was finally finished, George invited all of his friends to see it. The doctor and the nurse and the ambulance driver and the man from the newsstand and the woman and the elevator man and the two painters and the cook and the reporter and all the keepers of the zoo. Now the lights went out and the picture started. "This is George," the voice began. "He lived in the jungle. He was a good little monkey. He had only one fault. He was too curious." The end. All that reading makes me thirsty. Curious George rides a bike. Do you know how to ride a bike yet? I can ride a bike. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. This morning, George was curious the moment he woke up because he knew it was a special day. After breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we are going to celebrate because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight, I'll take you to the animal show, but first, I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George was very curious. Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to the house while I am gone." George could ride very well. He could even do all sorts of tricks. Monkeys are good at that. For instance, he could ride this way with both hands off the handlebar. And he could ride this way like a cowboy on a wild bronco. And he could also ride backwards. But after a while, George got tired of doing tricks and went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "It's a fine bike you have there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver the papers?" He handed George the bag and told him to do one side of the street first and then turn back and do the other side. George was very proud as he rode off with his bag. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street as he had been told. When he came to the last house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. He wanted to know what the river was like. So instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. There was a lot to see at the river. A man was fishing from the bridge. A duck family was paddling downstream, and 2 boys were playing with their boats. George would have liked to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boys might find out that he had not delivered all the papers, so he rode on. While riding along, George kept thinking of boats all the time. It would be such fun to have a boat. But how could he get one? He thought and thought, and then he had an idea. He got off the bicycle, took a newspaper out of the bag, and began to fold it. First, he folded down the corners like this. Then he folded both edges up, brought the ends together, and flattened it sideways. Then he turned one corner up, then the other one. Again, he brought the ends together and flattened it sideways. Then gently he pulled the ends open, and there was his boat. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? It did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all the papers and had made so many boats that he could not count them. A whole fleet. Watching his fleet sailing down the river, George felt like an admiral. But watching his fleet, he forgot to watch where he was going. Suddenly, there was a terrible jolt. The bicycle had hit a rock, and George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George was not hurt, but the front wheel of the bicycle was all out of shape, and the tire was blown out. George tried to ride the bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go. So he started carrying it, but it soon got too heavy. George did not know what to do. His new bike was very spoiled. The newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now he just stood there and cried. Suddenly his face brightened. Why, he had forgotten that he could ride on one wheel. He tried it, and it worked. He had hardly started out again when he saw something he had never seen before. Rolling toward him came an enormous tractor with huge trailers behind it. Looking out of the trailers were all sorts of animals. To George, it looked like a zoo on wheels. The tractor stopped, and two men jumped out. Well, well, said one of the men, a little monkey who can ride a bike bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I am the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time, and then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be. So the three of them got into the cab and drove off. Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show, the director said. I have a bugle for you right here, and later on you'll get a green coat and cap just like Bob's. On the show grounds, everybody was busy getting things ready for the show. I must do some work now, said the director. Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with all the animals. But you must not feed them, especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything, and he might get very sick afterwards. George was curious. Would the ostrich really eat anything? He wouldn't eat a bugle, or would he? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But a bugle is hard to swallow, even for an ostrich. It got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out of the bugle as the ostrich was struggling with it, all blue in the face. George was frightened. Fortunately, the men had heard the noise. They came rushing to the cage and got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. The director was very angry with George. We cannot use little monkeys who don't do as they are told, he said. Of course, you cannot take part in the show now. We will have to send you home. George had to sit on a bench all by himself, and nobody even looked at him. He was terribly sorry for what he had done, but now it was too late. He had spoiled everything. Meanwhile, the ostrich, always hungry, had got hold of a string dangling near his cage. This happened to be the string which held the door to the cage of the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened, and the baby bear got out. He ran away as fast as he could and made straight for a high tree near the camp. Nobody had seen it but George, and George was not supposed to leave his bench. But this was an emergency, so he jumped up, grabbed the bugle, and blew as loud as he could. Then he rushed to his bicycle. The men had heard the alarm. and thought at first that George had been naughty again. But when they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling at the string, they knew what had happened. George raced toward the tree, far ahead of the men. By now, the bear had climbed quite high, and this was dangerous because little bears can climb up a tree easily, but coming down is much harder. They might fall and get hurt. The men were worried. They did not know how to get him down safely, but George had a plan. With the bag over his shoulder, he went up the tree as fast as only a monkey can, and when he reached the baby bear, he put him in his bag and carefully let him down so that the men could safely catch him. Everybody cheered when George had come down from the tree. "You are a brave little monkey," said the director. "You saved the bear's life. Now you'll get your coat back, and of course you may ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see it, and how surprised they were to discover George on his bike right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there too, and also the man with the yellow hat. He had been looking for George everywhere and was happy to have found him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his bag again, and the people from the other side of the street, whose papers George had made into boats, were not angry with him anymore. When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle, and then George and his friend got into the car and went home. Good night. Our next story is Curious George Gets a Medal. Wonder what he's going to get a medal for. He's going to have to do something pretty spectacular. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. George was alone this morning, looking at a picture book, when the doorbell rang. It was the mailman. "Here is a letter for you," he said. "Put it on your friend's desk. He'll read it to you when he comes home." George was curious. It was not often that somebody wrote him. Too bad he could not read the letter, but maybe he could write one himself. In the top drawer of the desk there was paper and ink and a fountain pen. George sat down on the floor and began to write, but the pen was dry. It needed ink. George would have to fill it. He got a funnel from the kitchen and started pouring ink, but instead of going into the pen, the ink spilled all over and made a big blue puddle on the floor. It was an awful mess. Quickly, George got the blotter from the desk, but that was no help. The puddle grew bigger all the time. George had to think of something else. "Why, soap and water, that's what you clean up with." From the kitchen shelf, he got a big box of soap powder and poured all the powder over the ink. Do you think that's going to work? Then he pulled the garden hose through the window, opened the tap, and sprayed water on the powder. Oh no. Bubbles began to form, and then some lather, and more lather, more lather, and more lather. In no time, the whole room was full of lather, so full indeed that George had to escape in a hurry. When he was safely out of the house, he first turned off the tap. But what next? How could he get rid of all the lather before his friend came home? George sat down in the grass and thought for a long time. Finally, he had an idea. He would get the big shovel and shovel the lather out of the window. But where was the lather? While George had been outside thinking, it had all turned into water. Now the room looked like a lake and the furniture like islands in it. The shovel was no use. A pump was what George needed to get the water out, and he knew just where to find one. He had seen a portable pump at the farm down the road. The farmer was away working in the fields. Nobody noticed George when he got the pump out of the shed. It was heavy. He would need help to pull it all the way back to the house. Maybe he could tie the goat to the pump and make her pull it. But just as George was about to slip the hoop over the goat's head, he was hurled through the air and landed near a pen full of pigs. The biggest pig was standing near the gate. What if George opened the gate just enough to let him out? A big pig could easily pull a small pump. Carefully, George lifted the latch. And before he knew it, all the pigs had burst out of the pen, grunting and squealing and trying to get away as fast as they could. George was delighted. He had never seen anything like it. For the moment, all his troubles were forgotten. But now, the pigs were all gone, and not a single one was left to help him with the pump. Luckily, there were some cows grazing nearby. Cows were gentle and strong. It would mean nothing to a cow to pull the pump for him. This time George was right. The cow did not mind being tied to the pump. She even let him climb on her back, and off they went. George was glad. Now he would soon be home, pump out the room, and everything would be all right. Meanwhile, the farmer and his son had heard the squealing of the pigs. They rushed home from the fields and now had their hands full catching all the pigs. Not until the last pig was safely back in the pen did they have time to look around. And what did they see? A little monkey riding on their cow, making off with their pump. The chase was on. George and the cow were ahead at first, but the pump was slowing them down. The farmers were getting closer and closer. Now they had almost caught up with them, but where was George? Here he was, hiding in a shirt. The farmers had run past him, but on their way home, they had to come back over the same road. George did not feel safe in his hiding place. Just then, a truck came rattling down the road. George jumped aboard. Monkeys are good at jumping, and was gone before the farmers had a chance to see him. The truck drove to a part of town that George had never seen before. At last, it stopped in front of a large building. It was the museum. George did not know what a museum was. He was curious. While the guard was busy reading his paper, George slipped inside. He walked up the steps and into a room full of all sorts of animals. At first, George was scared, but then he noticed that they did not move. They were not alive. They were stuffed animals put into the museum so that everybody could get a good look at them. In the next room, George saw something so enormous it took his breath away. It was a dinosaur. George was not scared this time. He knew it was not real. He looked at the dinosaur and then at the baby dinosaur. And then he saw the palm tree full of nuts. George liked nuts. Suddenly he felt very hungry. He had missed lunch that day. He would climb up and just then he heard footsteps. He had to hide again. But where? A family came in to take a look at the dinosaur. They paid no attention to the little monkey who was standing there. The monkey did not move. He stood so still they thought he was just another stuffed animal. Whew. George was glad when they were gone. Now he could pick the nuts. He climbed up the dinosaur's neck and started to pull, but the nuts would not come off. George did not know they were not real either. He pulled harder and harder. The tree began to sway. Crash! Down came the tree on the dinosaur's head. Down came the dinosaur. And down came George. Guards came rushing in from all sides, and underneath the fallen dinosaur, they found a little monkey. They pulled him out of there and brought him to Professor Wiseman, who was the director of the museum. Professor Wiseman was terribly angry. "Lock that naughty monkey up right away," he said, "and take him back to the zoo. He must have run away from there." George was carried off in a cage. He felt so ashamed he almost wished he were dead. Suddenly the door opened. "George!" somebody shouted. It was his friend, the man with the yellow hat. "It seems you got yourself into a lot of trouble today, but maybe this letter here will get you out of it. It's from Professor Wiseman. He needs your help for an experiment. I found it on my desk at home, but I couldn't find you anywhere, so I came over here to talk to the professor. And this is what the letter said. Dear George, a small spaceship has been built by our experimental station. It is too small for a man, but could carry a little monkey. Would you be willing to go up in it? I have never met you, but I hear that you are a bright little monkey who can do all sorts of things, and that is just what we need. We want you to do something nobody has ever done before. Bail out of a spaceship in flight. When we flash you a signal, you will have to open the door and bail out with the help of emergency rockets. We hope that you are willing and that your friend will permit you to go. Gratefully yours, Professor Wiseman, Director of the Science Museum. So you are George, Professor Wiseman said. If I had only known. Of course, everything will be forgiven if you are willing to go. They got the smallest size spacesuit for George and all the other things he needed for the flight. Then they helped him put them on and showed him how to use them. When everything was ready, a truck drove up with a special television screen mounted on it to watch the flight. They all got on and were off to the launching site. They checked all the controls of the spaceship, especially the lever that opened the door. George tried it too. But listen, here's all the things he needed. He needed a spacesuit, complete with shoes and gloves, a space helmet, an oxygen tank, 2 emergency rockets, and 1 parachute. There he is wearing all that before he got on the truck. The great moment had come. George waved goodbye and went aboard. The door was closed. Professor Wiseman began to count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! He pressed the button and the ship rose into the air, slowly first, and then faster and faster and higher until they could no longer see it in the sky. But on the screen, they saw George clearly all the time. Now the moment had come for George to bail out. Professor Wiseman flashed the signal. They watched the screen. George did not move. Why didn't he pull the lever? In a few seconds, it would be too late. The ship would be lost in outer space with George in it. They waited anxiously. At last, George began to move. Slowly, as if in a daze, he was groping for the lever. Would he reach it in time? There, he had grabbed it, and the door opened. Hurrah! George was on his way. Out of the blue, an open parachute came floating down to earth. The truck raced over to the spot where George would land. What a welcome for George. Professor Wiseman hung a big golden medal around his neck. Because, he said, you are the first living being to come back to Earth from a space flight. And on the medal it said, to George, the first space monkey. Then a newspaper man took his picture, and everybody shouted and cheered, even the farmer and his son, and the kind woman from next door who had worked for hours to get the water out of the room. I'm proud of you, George, said the man with the yellow hat. I guess the whole world is proud of you today. It was the happiest day in George's life. The end. Whoa, that was a very busy day for George, wasn't it? Let's read Curious George Flies a Kite. But first, another drink of water. This is George. He lives in the house of the man with the yellow hat. George is a little monkey, and all monkeys are curious. But no monkey is as curious as George. That is why his name is Curious George. I have to go out now, said the man with the yellow hat. Be a good little monkey till I come back. Have fun and play with your new ball, but do not be too curious. And the man went out. You'd think that man would learn, wouldn't you? Every day he goes out and tells George not to be curious, and every day George does shenanigans. Let's see. It was a lot of fun for George to play with his new ball. The ball went up and George went up, and the ball went down, and George went down. George could do a lot of tricks with his ball, too. This was one of his tricks. He could get up on the ball like this, or do it this way with his head down. This was another trick George could do. He could hold the ball on his head like this. Look, no hands. What a good trick. But where did the ball go? George ran after it. The ball had gone into another room. There was a big window in the room. George liked to look out of that window. He could see a lot from there. He let the ball go and looked out. George could see Bill on his bike and the lake with a boat on it. George could see a big house and a little garden and a little house and a big garden. The big house was the house where Bill lived. But who lived in the little house? George was curious. Who could live in a house that was so little? George had to find out, so he went to the big garden. The garden had a high wall, but not too high for a monkey. George got up on the wall. All he had to do now was jump down, so George jumped down into the big garden. Now he could take a good look at the little house. And what did he see? A big white bunny and a lot of little bunnies. George looked and looked and looked. Bunnies were something new to him. How funny they were. The big bunny was Mother Bunny. She was as big as George. But the little bunnies were so little that George could hold one of them in his hand. And that is what he wanted to do. How could he get a bunny out of the house? A house must have a door to get in and get out. But where was the door to the bunny house? Oh, there it was. George put his hand in and took out a baby bunny. What fun it was to hold a baby bunny, and the bunny did not mind. It sat in his hand, one ear up and one ear down, and looked at George, and George looked back at it. Now he and the bunny could play in the garden. They could play a game. They could play Get the Bunny. George would let the bunny hop away, and then he would run after it and get it back. George put the bunny down. Then he looked away. 1, 2, run! The bunny was off like a shot. George did not look. Now he had to wait a little. 1, 2, 3, 4. He waited. Then George looked up. Where was the bunny? He could not see it. Where had it gone? George looked for it here and he looked for it there. He could not find it. Where was the bunny? It could not get out of the garden. It could not get up the wall the way George could. It could not fly away. It had to be here, but it was not. The bunny was gone, and all the fun was gone too. George sat down. He had been a bad little monkey. Why was he so curious? Why did he let the bunny go? Now he could not put it back into the bunny house where it could be with Mother Bunny. Mother Bunny. George looked up. Why, that was it. Mother Bunny could help him. George got up. He had to have some string. Maybe there was some in the garden. Yes, there was a string, and a good one too. George took the string and went back to the bunny house. Mother Bunny was at the door. George let her out and put the string on her, and Mother Bunny knew what to do. Away she went with her head down and her ears up. All George could do was hold the string and run after her. And then Mother Bunny sat down. She saw something, and George saw it too. Something white that looked like a tail, like the tail of the baby bunny, and that is what it was. But where was the rest of the bunny? It was down in a hole. A bunny likes to dig a hole and then go down and live in it. But this bunny was too little to live in a hole. It should live in a bunny house. So George got hold of the little white tail and pulled the baby bunny out. Then they all ran back to the bunny house. George did not have to put a string on the baby bunny. It ran after its mother all the way home. George took the string off Mother Bunny and helped them back into the house. Then Mother Bunny and all the little ones lay down to sleep. George looked at them. It was good to see the baby bunny back where it should be. And now George would go back to where he should be. When he came to the wall, he could see something funny in back of it. George got up on the wall to find out what it was. He saw a long string on a long stick. A fat man had the long stick in his hand. What could the man do with a stick that long? George was curious. The fat man was on his way to the lake, and soon George was on his way to the lake too. The man took a hook out of his box, put it on a string, and then put something on the hook. Then the man let the string down into the water and waited. Now George knew the string on the stick was to fish with. When the man pulled the string out of the water, there was a big fish on the hook. George saw the man pull one fish after another out of the lake till he had all the fish he wanted. What fun it must be to fish! George wanted to fish too. He had his string. All he needed was a stick, and he knew where to get that. George ran home as fast as he could. In the kitchen, he took the mop off the wall. A mop would make a good stick. Now George had the string and the stick. He was all set to fish. Or was he? Not yet. George had to have a hook, and on the hook, something that fish liked to eat. Fish would like cake, and George knew where to find some. But where could he get a hook? Why, there was a hook for the mop on the kitchen wall. It would have to come out. With the hook on the string and the string on the stick and the cake in the box in his hand, George went back to the lake. George sat down, put some cake on the hook, and let the line down into the water. Now he had to wait, just as the man had waited. George was curious. The fish were curious too. All kinds of fish came to look at the line, big fish and little fish, fat fish and thin fish, red fish and yellow fish, and blue fish. One of them was near the hook. The cake was just what he wanted. George sat and waited. Then the line shook. There must be a fish on the hook. George pulled the line up. The cake was gone, but no fish was on the hook. Too bad. George put more cake on the hook. Maybe this time he would get a fish. But no, the fish just took the cake off the hook and went away. Well, if George could not get the fish would not get the cake. George would eat it. He liked cake too. He would find another way to get a fish. George looked into the water. That big red one there with the long tail. It was so near, maybe he could get it with his hands. George got down as low as he could and put out his hand. Splash! Into the lake he went. We knew that was going to happen, right? Yeah. The water was cold and wet, and George was cold and wet too. This was no fun at all. When he came out of the water, Bill was there with his kite. My, you are wet, Bill said. I saw you fall in, so I came to help you get out. Too bad you did not get a fish, but it is good the fish did not get you. Now I can show you how high my kite can fly, Bill went on. Bill put his bike up near the tree, and then they ran off. There was a lot of wind that day, and that was just what they needed. The wind took the kite up fast. George was too little to hold it in this wind. A kite that big could fly away with him, so Bill had to hold it. George saw the kite go up and up and up. What fun it was to fly a kite. They let the kite fly for a long time, till Bill said, I will get the kite down now. I must go home, and so you should too. But when Bill pulled the string in, the kite got into the top of a high tree. Bill could not get it down. Oh, my fine new kite! I cannot let go of it. I must have it back, Bill said, but the tree is too high for me. But no tree was too high for George. He went up to the top in no time. Then, little by little, he got the string out of the tree. Down he came with the kite and gave it back to Bill. Thank you, George. Thanks a lot, Bill said. I am so happy to have the kite back. Now you may have a ride home on my bike. I will run back to the lake and get it. You wait here for me with the kite. but do not let it fly away. George looked at the kite. Then he took the string in his hand. He knew he could not fly the kite in this wind, but maybe he could let it go up just a little bit. George was curious. He let the string go a little, then a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more. When Bill came back, there was no kite, and there was no George. "George," he called, "where are you?" Then he looked up. There they were, way up in the sky. Bill had to get help fast. He would go to the man with the yellow hat. The man would know what to do. "George is not here," said the man with the yellow hat when Bill came. "Have you seen him?" "George and my kite are up in the sky near the lake," Bill shouted. "I came to—" But the man did not wait to hear any more. He ran to his car and jumped in. "I will get him back," he said. "I must get George back." All this time the wind took the kite up and George with it. It was fun to fly about in the sky, but when George looked down, the fun was gone. He was up so high that all the big houses looked as little as bunny houses. George did not like it a bit. He wanted to get down, but how? Not even a monkey can jump from the sky. George was scared. What if he never got back? Maybe he would fly on and on and on. Oh, he would never, never be so curious again if just this one time he could find a way to get home. What was that? George could hear something, and then he saw something fly in the sky just like a kite. It was a helicopter, and in the helicopter, hurrah, was the man with the yellow hat. Down from the helicopter came a long line. George got hold of it, and the man with the yellow hat pulled him up. George held on to the kite, for he had to give it back to Bill. "I am so happy to have you back, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "I was scared, and you must have been scared too. I know you will not want to fly a kite again for a long, long time. You must give it back to Bill when we get home." "Hurrah!" Bill shouted when George came to give him the kite. "George is back, and my kite is back too." And then Bill took George by the hand and went with him into the little garden, and from the little garden into the big garden where the bunny house was. "Here is one of my baby bunnies," Bill said. "Take it, it is for you." A baby bunny for George. George took it in his hands and held it way up. It was his bunny now. He could take it home with him. And that is what he did. All right. Curious George learns the alphabet. Are you ready to learn the alphabet with George? I wonder how many ways he can get in trouble just learning the alphabet. Let's see. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. This morning, George was looking at some of his friend's books. They were full of little black marks with dots and lines, and George was curious. What could one do with them? The man with the yellow hat came just in time. "You don't tear a book apart to find out what's in it," he said. "You read it. George, books are full of stories. Stories are made of words, and words are made of letters. If you want to read a story, you first have to know the letters of the alphabet. Let me show you." The man took a big pad and began to draw. George was curious. "This is an A," the man said. "The A is the first letter of the alphabet." Now we add 4 feet and a long tail, and the A becomes an alligator with his mouth wide open. The word alligator starts with an A. This is a big A. There is also a small a. All letters come in big and small. This is a small a. It looks like a piece of an apple. George knew alligators and apples. You could eat apples. Alligators could eat you if you didn't watch out. This is a big bee. The big bee looks like a bird if we put feet on it and a tail and a bill. The word bird begins with a B. Birds come in all colors. This bird is blue. George loved to watch birds. This is a small bee. It could be a bee. This bee is busy buzzing around a blossom. The bee's body has black and yellow stripes. George kept away from bees. They might sting, and that would be bad. This is a big C. We will make it into a big crab, with a shell and feet and 2 claws. This is a small C. The small C is like the big C, only smaller, so it becomes a small crab. It's cute. Crabs live in the ocean. They can swim or run sideways and backwards. Crabs can be funny, but they can also pinch you. You now have 3 letters, George, the man said, A and B and C. With these 3 letters, you can make a word. The first word you can read yourself. The word is cab. Cab. You know what a cab is. I once took you for a ride in a cab, remember? And now, let's draw the next letter. The big D could be a dinosaur. There are no live dinosaurs today. They have died out. Those you see in museums are dummies. George had seen dinosaurs in a museum once. The small D looks like a dromedary. A dromedary is a camel with 1 hump. Riding on a dromedary can make you dizzy because it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. The big E is an elephant. He is eating his evening meal, eggplants. George loved elephants. The small E could be the ear of a man or the ear of a monkey. People's ears and monkeys' ears look very much alike. The big F is a fireman fighting a fire. Never fool the fire department or you go to jail, and that's no fun. The small f is a flower. George's friend was fond of flowers. George preferred food. The big G is a goose. Goose starts with a G, like George. The small g is a goldfish. He is in a glass bowl and looks happy. Now you know 7 letters, George, said the man. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. With these letters, we can already make quite a few words. I have written some of them down for you. You read them while I get your lunch. Dad, Ed, bad, bag, cage, bed, feed. It seems like the only word you can read is bad, said the man when he came back. I think we had enough for one morning. I'll feed you now, and then you take your nap. After your nap, we'll go on with our letters. The big H is a house. It stands on a hill behind a hedge. George's home used to be the jungle. Now he lives in a house. The small h is a horse. He is happy because he has heaps of hay. George had his own horse, a hobby horse. The big I is just a long line going straight down. It does not look like much. It could be an icicle. The small I is a line with a dot on top. It could be an iguana. An iguana is a sort of lizard. Iguanas don't like ice. They like the warm sunshine. So does George. The big J is a jaguar. Jaguars live in the jungle. George knew jaguars. He had lived in the jungle once. The small j is a jack-in-the-box. George had a jack-in-the-box as a toy. He just loved to make it jump. The big K is a kangaroo called Katie. The small K is a small kangaroo. He is Katie's kid. The big L is a lion. He is lucky. He is going to have leg of lamb for lunch, and he loves it. The small L is a lean lady. She is strolling along a lake, licking a lollipop. George liked lollipops. The big M is a mailman. His name is Mr. Miller. He brings a letter. Maybe it's for me, thinks George. The small M is a mouse. He is munching mints. And do you know what else it is? Said the man to George. M is the 13th letter of the ABC. The whole alphabet has only 26 letters, so 13 is just half of it. You can make lots of words with these letters. Why don't you try? Here is a pad and pencil. George started to think of words, and then he wrote them down. It was fun to make words out of letters. Let me see, said the man. Ball, milk, cake, ham, jam, egg, lime, feed, kid. That was very good. But what on earth is a dog, or a glidge, or a blimlimlim? There are no such things. Just any letters do not make words, George. Let's look at some new letters now. The big N is a napkin standing on a dinner plate. It looks neat. George had seen napkins folded that way in the restaurant when he was a dishwasher. The small N is the nose on the face of a man. He has a new blue necktie on and is nibbling noodles. The big O is a big ostrich, and the small O is a small ostrich, of course. Ostriches eat odd objects. One ostrich once had tried to eat a bugle that belonged to George. The big P is a big penguin, and the small p is a small penguin. These penguins live near the South Pole. They use their flappers as paddles. George knew penguins from the zoo. The big Q is a quail. Quails have short tails. You must keep quiet if you want to watch quails. They are quite shy. The small Q is a quarterback. The quarterback has to be quick. George was quick. He could qualify as a quarterback. And now, get your football, George, said the man. It will do you good to play a little before we go on with your letters. George knew how to play the game. He knew how to carry the ball, and how to take a three-point stance, and how to get ready for the kickoff. He was a fine halfback, too, and he could make a short pass or recover a fumble. Good game, said the man, but time's up now. Back to the alphabet. The big R is a rabbit. Some rabbits are white with red eyes. Rabbits love radishes. George loved rabbits. He had one as a pet. The small R is a rooster. The rooster crows when the sun rises. Two roosters will start a rumpus. They really can get rough. The big S is a big snail, and the small s is a small snail. Snails are slow. They sneak into their shells when they are scared of something. George thought snails looked silly. The big T is a table. The table is set for two. It is time for tea. George did not care for tea, but he liked toast. The small T is a tomahawk. George had a toy tomahawk. It was a tiny one. He took it along when he played Indian. He also had a teepee, an Indian tent. Now it's time for a snack, said the man. Run over to the baker, George, and hand him this note. Then come right back with the doughnuts, 1 dozen of them, and no tricks, please. George was curious. He looked at the note the man had written. 1 dozen doughnuts. Maybe he could write something on it too. How about writing 10 instead of just 1? He had just learned the T, first a T, and then an E, and then an N. Said the baker. 10 dozen doughnuts is quite a lot, but that's what the note says. We need an extra big bag for them. See, and I wondered how George could get in trouble just learning his letters. Guess we found out. Why, George, cried the man when he saw the note. Well, that comes from teaching the alphabet to a little monkey, and I told you no tricks. You may not eat any doughnuts now, George. Put them back in the bag, and let's go on with the letters. The big U is an umbrella standing upright. The umbrella handle is also like a U. George knew how to use an umbrella. The small U is a small umbrella. When it is raining, umbrellas are useful. but you must keep under the umbrella unless you want to get wet. George thought rain was a nuisance. The big V is a big Valentine, and the small V is a small Valentine. George loved Valentines. He got several Valentine cards every year. One card came from Nevada. The big W and the small W are whiskers, big ones and small ones. A walrus has whiskers. Some men have whiskers, and cats have whiskers. George did not have whiskers, but he was curious how he would look if he did. The next letter of the alphabet is X. The big X and the small x look alike, only one is big and one is small, just like the big W and the small w, or the V, or the U, or the S, and some of the other letters. But, said the man, there are few words that start with an X, and they don't look like an X, except one, and that is Xmas. Santa stands for Xmas. There is only one Santa, so we need only one picture. George thought Xmas was exciting. The big Y is a big yak, and the small y is a small yak. He is still young. Your yaks live in Tibet. If you haven't seen any yaks yet, you may find one at the zoo. The big Z is a big zebra, and the small z is a small zebra. The zebras are zipping along with zest. And you know what? Said the man. Z is the last letter. Now you know all 26 letters of the alphabet. And now you may have the donuts. The end. All right, I think this is the last one in the book. Curious George goes to the hospital. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. What could be in it? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and colors. George took one out. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew it, he had swallowed it. A little while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. "Why, George," he said, "I see you have already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's go to work on it." Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. "That's strange," he said. "It's a brand new puzzle." "Well, it cannot be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George." The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache and did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. "I'll be over as soon as I can," said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out his stethoscope and listened. "I'm not sure what's wrong," he said. "You better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray taken. I'll call them and let them know you are coming." "Don't worry, George," said the man when they were driving to the hospital. "You have been there before when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were?" George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. A nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tasted sweet. "It is called barium," the nurse explained. "It helps the doctors find out what is wrong with you, George." In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was just putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. "You get on that table, George," the doctor said. "I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides." He pushed a button, and there was a funny noise. "There, now you may get up, and we will have the x-rays developed right away." Now let's see. There is something there that should not be, said the doctor when they were looking at the x-rays. Why, that looks like, I think that must be the piece that was missing in our jigsaw puzzle yesterday, said the man. Well, 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 said the doctor. At least we know now what is wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They'll put a tube down his throat to get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call a nurse and have her take you to the admitting office. Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. Look, Betsy, the woman next to him said to her little girl. There is Curious George. Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to a hospital before. She was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and his address and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. It has your name on it, George, she said, so that everybody knows who you are. Then the pretty young nurse came back. My name is Carol, she said. I am going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and put you to bed. There will be lots of children to keep you company. And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around. Others were in their beds with a doctor or a nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had his leg bandaged and was sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was in bed looking sad. George got the bed next to Betsy. George was glad when he was in his bed at last. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while. Now I have to leave you, George, he finally said. I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to sleep. Then he left. George just sat there and cried. As he had promised, the man was back early the next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature, one was taking his blood pressure, one was giving him a pill. To make you sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. It's going to hurt, George, she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm, and George let out a scream. But the needle hasn't touched you yet, said the nurse, laughing. There, now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, it really was not. And anyway, it was over now. By the time the attendant came with the stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. He could see a big table with bright lamps over it and doctors and nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their faces. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house when it had all started. He looked funny with his mask on. And then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He did not even know where he was. Then he saw Nurse Carol. It's all done, George, she said. They got the piece out. In a day or two, you will be running around again. The man had brought him a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy. His throat was hurting too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. We'll let him sleep, said Nurse Carol. The more he sleeps, the better. The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came in to see him, and the man, of course, came too. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk, he said. Boy, I can hardly wait. I'll take you to the playroom now, George, Nurse Carol said the next morning, and in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home. The playroom was full of children. A lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint. There were all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater, and that was just the thing for George. He had 4 hands, so he could handle 4 puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon and a clown and a bear and a policeman. The children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy, for the first time, smiled a little. There was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious. If he climbed on the record player and turned the switch, would it go round and round like a merry-go-round? It did. It started slowly, then it went faster and faster, and whoopee! George had lost his balance and was sailing through the air. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion. The children cheered, and Betsy smiled again. George was so funny. But then the play lady picked George up. "That's enough for now," she said. "You'd better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us. The mayor is coming to visit the hospital today, and later on you will be going home, George." When George woke up, Steve was just taking his first steps. A nurse was helping him, and the children were watching. The go-kart was standing there empty. George was curious. He looked at it, then he climbed into it. George. Then he grabbed the wheels, and then, while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart go very fast. This was fun. Down the hall he went. By now, the nurse had noticed that he was gone and came running after him. "George! George!" she shouted. But George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, where some men were busy pushing lunch carts, and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled. Spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jam were all over the floor. People fell over each other, and George was thrown out of the go-kart and landed right in the mayor's arms. What a mess it was. "You broke all my dishes," someone cried. "You ruined the go-kart," complained another. "What will the mayor think of it?" whispered someone else. And so it went. Suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From above came happy laughter, and there stood Betsy, laughing, laughing, laughing. Then the children joined in. Then the mayor started laughing, and finally everybody just laughed and laughed. Everybody, that is, except George. Betsy came running down the ramp, threw her arms around George and kissed him. "Don't be sad, George," she said. "The whole thing was so funny. I never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad you were in the hospital with me." Now the director of the hospital spoke. "I am sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor," he said, "but I think we'll just clean up the mess and be done with it. George," he went on, "you've made a terrible mess, but you also made our sad little Betsy happy again, and that is more than any of us has done. And now I see your friend has just come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take good care of yourself." The children crowded around the windows waving goodbye when George and the man with the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. As the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running after them. "Here's a little package with something that belongs to you, George," she called, "but don't open it before you are home." George was curious. Well, who would not be? The moment he reached home, he ripped the paper off, tore open the box, and there was the piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. "How nice of the doctor to save it for us," said the man with the yellow hat. "And now we can finish the puzzle." The end. I hope that you have enjoyed all of these Curious George books. I've sure enjoyed reading them.